let's begin the last panel of this fascinating conference. Since it is last, I want to probably express everybody's feeling of gratitude to Valeria, who organized it all, brought such a wonderful group of people to Colombia and inspired such uplifting and educational discussions during which we all are learning a lot. I'm Mark Lipovetsky, professor of Slavic languages at Columbia, and I'm very happy to introduce participants of this panel. The first paper, Mother Tongue and Other Tongues, Aninsky and the Psychology of Language, will be presented by Brian Kim, who is an assistant professor of Russian and East European Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, where he teaches courses on 18th and 19th century Russian literature and culture, and is affiliated with the graduate program in comparative literature and literary theory. In addition to his main teaching areas, his scholarly interests include language ideology and linguistic culture, translation studies, sociology of literature, and history of vocabulary, lexicography. He is currently completing his first book manuscript, Linguistic Fantasies, Foreign and Universal in the Russian Findicicle, and embarking on a second, tentatively titled Towards a Learned Society, Russia, America, and the Transatlantic Enlightenment. He's also co-editing a volume of translations of symbolist criticism on Dostoevsky and Tolstoy titled Seers of Flesh and Spirit. The next speaker, actually she will be the one, I confused the order of things, right? Is Marina Mogilner. Marina, as probably many of us know, is a co-founder and co-editor of the Ab Imperia Quarterly and one of the authors, co-authors of New Imperial History as a project and as a system of approaches in the field of Eurasian, Russian, Soviet, and East European studies. She is a professor of history at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and author of several very important books, which I will only list. The first book, Mythology of the Underground Man, Russian Radical Microcosm in the Early 20th Century as an Object of Semiotic Analysis. Second book, Homo Imperii, a history of physical anthropology in Russia, which was substantially revised in the English edition of 2013. The third book is A Race for the Future, Scientific Visions of Modern Russian Jewishness. The following is the book Jews, Race, and the Politics of Difference, the case of Vladimir Zhabotinsky against the Russian Empire, and that's the book of 2023. And the discussant at this panel is Ilya Vinitsky, professor of Russian at Princeton University, a well-known expert in Russian Romanticism and realism, and recently an increasingly, I would say, a specialist in 20th century writings. He is very well known by his History of Russian Literature, co-authored with Andrew Wachtel, his books on Vasily Zhukovsky, spiritual poetry, to put it mildly, meaning the poetry written by spirits, not on spiritual subjects. Most recently, his books, Russian and English, on the Count of Sardinia, Dmitry Khvostov, and Russian culture, investigating the phenomenon of anti-poetry, and his collection of articles published in Russian entitled "О чем молчит соловей," has become an intellectual bestseller and sort of is on the top of many lists. Ilya is also the winner of the Guggenheim Award for his another fascinating project about the imposter and political literary activist Ivan Narodny. So we have a great group of people, and I'm giving the floor to Marina with the title of her paper, Ethnographic Gothics, Writing Human Sacrifice in Modern Russian Imperial Ethnography, 1880s, 1910s.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thank you all for staying until the last panel, and my special thanks to Valeria for adding one historian to this wonderful group of literary scholars, so please bear with me. This is my kind of first presentation on the new project that I've started after I completed my lifelong almost project on Jewish self-racializing in the Russian Empire. And this project considers the invention of human sacrifice and new primitivism in Russian imperial ethnography of the turn of the century. I put my quotes on slides, so please try to read them while I'm talking, because I want to save time and not to read quotes. So this sensational newspaper report appeared in Kazan newspaper in 1894 and reflected the moral panic among the late 19th century Russian educated society provoked by the so-called Multan case. So the story began in May of 1892 in the taiga-covered triangle between Volga and Kama rivers, where a peasant girl came across a decapitated, dismembered male body lacking internal organs and laying openly across a trail in the forest. The district police investigators and some local peasants immediately pointed to the village of Old Multan, populated primarily by Votyaks, Finno-Ugric peoples, now they Udmurts. So these are images taken by Vladimir Korolenko, who played a huge role in this story. The prosecution argued that the victim, who was identified as a Russian peasant beggar, was sacrificed by the old Multan Votyaks to their pagan gods. So the investigation dragged on for 29 months and was fraught with multiple violations. Two different juries in 1894 and 1895 issued guilty verdicts, and this was already a reformed court of juries, so this was a peasant jury who made these decisions. So both convictions were annulled by the Supreme Court at the time, the Senate, before all the remaining Votyaks were finally acquitted in a third trial in 1896, largely due to the empire-wide publicity brought to the case by the writer Vladimir Korolenko and many journalists, ethnographers, and physicians. And the case itself was understood as a so-called scandal of empire, and basically what was at stake was empire's civilizational mission and Russia's potential to civilize. Here you can see, some justifications for this. So unlike the Jewish blood libel that relied on the pre-existing script, the Wojciech blood libel had to be invented from scratch. And hence the courtroom became the space where this ethnographic invention took place. The court deliberation transcripts read as an agonistic ethnographic performance. This is a quote from the indictment that gives you an idea of how ethnography of religious customs was central to the construction of the accusation. The guilty verdicts, both guilty verdicts, were entirely based on ethnographic expertise for the lack of other evidence. So succumbing to the pressure coming from the Senate and from the Russian public, the court agreed to invite actual ethnographic experts to deliver their verdict, to testify. The expert that was approved for the defense was Diakon Grigory Vereshchagin, who was a missionary ethnographer, village teacher, priest, and a Wojciech by origin. And Vereshchagin advanced a missionary ethnographic paradigm that, when I started this case, I realized that there are no studies actually on missionary ethnography in our field. So this paradigm remains very poorly explored and understood until nowadays. And there are multiple reasons for that. One of them is that the Russian state, never embraced mission as its colonial arm explicitly. But missionary societies with popular following were also absent in the Russian Empire, and unlike, for example, in Britain, missionary fiction never played an important role in, in history of Russian educated society, never represented an important cultural phenomenon. There were almost no Russian equivalents to, fictional text that had as their protagonist this masculine figure of missionary adventurer in colonial settings. By the time of the Multan case, the Volga-Kama priest missionaries themselves wondered about their ethnographic records, and some of them went to consistorial archives to unearth missionary records, missionary reports, starting from the 16th century in search for traces of human sacrifice in them. As it turned out, local clergy did not rely on this trope, neither at the time of Muscovy nor in the 19th century. And this discovery, which my archival research also supports, contradicts a widely accepted view positing missionaries' propensity to exacerbate barbarity of the indigenous population in exchange for the involvement of the colonial state in missionary enterprise. Nicholas Dirk's succinct formula, I quote, "In late colonial India, anthropology appropriated barbarism from the missionaries," unquote, is an epitome of this rigid approach that has been rejected or nuanced by other scholars. In the Multan courtroom, Vereshchagin's testimony refuted Dirk's's teleology. Vereshchagin decisively rejected the reality of what a human sacrifice. That said, his ethnographic expertise was very local. It was based exactly on what he personally knew and saw. It did not rely on comparative method. It did not attempt to kind of ontologize water groupness. It split it into small regional communities. And so this testimony was basically recognized as pretty much unsatisfactory, as not modern. By the court, as well as by the lawyer for the defense, Dryagin, who by the time of the third hearing basically complained that, again, Vereshchagin was approved and he is not a real expert. So the expert for the prosecution was the opposite to Vereshchagin. This was Kazan University professor Ivan Smirnov, who embodied the very paradigm of modern ethnography. He was a Taylorian ethnographer. He was very much influenced by primitive culture and the pleasures of classifications that we've discussed. So to the peasant jury, Smirnov explained the basics of Taylorian method. He introduced the concept of survivals. He offered examples of survivals of human sacrifice in world folklore and in local Inarodse traditions. Although the final decision eventually acquitted the Wojciechs, modern ethnographic approach prevailed. And in the post-Multan era, human sacrifice was discovered among the empire Buddhists, and there were cases, legal cases there, also among all believers, wanderers in particular, among Rusians in the western borderlands of the empire, and among native peoples of the Russian north. It entered the imaginary of Eurasian pagan antiquity and preoccupied those interested in psychological motivations of modern Russian sacrificial political terrorism, primitivism, and essentially ethnographic concept informed by the semantics of barbarism and savagery became a popular fin de siècle aesthetics, as we know. Modern ethnography provided an epistemological framework for an interpretative patterns for such speculations, but the narrative of human sacrifice remained a challenge, just as it presented a challenge during the Multan case. Ideally, modern ethnographic narrative was expected to combine elements of both missionary and modern ethnography, that is a neo-positivist, data-oriented logic and typologies and global comparisons with specific field-based descriptive reports of observable reality. However, not a single ethnographer ever observed human sacrifice in the field. So my question in this paper is, how could the imagined human sacrifice be written in a modern ethnographic mode? So Wojciech animal sacrifice served as a natural blueprint for the narration of Wojciech human sacrifice. Animal sacrifice could be observed and verified, and as such, it presented a key contact point with the evidential reality. Missionary ethnography was full of detailed accounts of animal sacrifice. In the period of especially active reporting in the 1840s and 50s, missionaries routinely listed, and I quote from archival sources, rams and dogs, the whole horse separated into pieces, the soft parts eaten and the rest scattered around, a slaughtered bull, a stallion and a goose, and so on, but never humans, never human flesh and blood. So missionaries never crossed the line into the sphere of speculations about human sacrifice. Lay ethnographers of animal sacrifice tended to establish a clear distance between a scholar and his objects, but the objects, the collective Wojciechs, still looked ethnographically familiar, being a variation of generic peasants. And these reports frequently referenced, Russian syncretic peasant orthodoxy. So on the top is one typical example that you find in this report. So basically animal sacrifice, and even more so its survivals, was as normal features of various cultures studied by ethnographers. Moreover, ethnographers did not necessarily center the moment of slaughter, especially when they did not intend to construct a human sacrifice. Instead, they described communal eating, sharing with neighbors, and praying, and also emphasized the influence of orthodoxy on these so-called pagan prayers. So instead of dirt and blood, these universal markers of savagery and disorder, they often registered rituals of cleanness. For example, one report on bull's sacrifice opens with a scene in a bathhouse where Wojciech family is washing and changing into clean clothes in preparation for the event. And in general, a typical description of animal sacrifice would be narrated in a mode familiar from realistic prose. So this is a typical quote at the bottom of the slide. So against this background, ethnographic narratives of human sacrifice emerge as a particular Gothic genre. First, instead of enforcing this sense of familiarity and transparency, they cultivated secrecy and suspense. One could learn about the ritual of human sacrifice only by picking up some random words and hints from the Wojciech's internal conversations. For Wojciech themselves would never reveal to an ethnographer their dark secret. So these are examples to the right. Second, religious syncretism, a common feature of peasant societies in missionary and many lay ethnographies, was exposed as a cover-up for real and lasting savagery that reveals itself when times are hard, quotes on the left side of the slide. So these Wojciechs were not generic peasants. They acquired unique and disturbing qualities, and only specially trained experts could identify and correctly interpret clues and signs of their hidden barbarity. So ethnographic narratives of human sacrifice thus dealt with clues and signs, considering them within a distinct temporality centered on a deep past. Wojciech places of worships, especially sacral groves, were described as extremely ancient. They were not just random sites. They were tunnels into another reality. I quote, according to Wojciech, this grove had been designated for sacrifices by a diviner in antiquity, unquote. What was called a grove in the beginning of an ethnographic narrative could easily become deep forest toward its end. No, sorry. Yeah, so quotes on the left side. In other words, deep past was constantly reenacted in deep forests. The deep forest chronotope was constructed at the time of the region's colonization by the Russian peasants, that is after the emancipation reform of 1868, which produced this colonizing force and also reinforced Russian nationalism because it enabled now and the imagination of a modern Russian nation based on like free peasants, not serfs. And so this created a land competition in the region and led to deforestation. Thus, one Kazan ethnographer writing in 1833 explained that now Wojciechs had to be content with small bosques consisting literally of a few trees and located on a hill near each village. And this is a quote from another ethnographer who was actually old baptized Tatar and an Orthodox priest and also missionary, who basically confirmed the same observation. So in other words, the narrative construction of the deep forest chronotope was happening just when the actual disappearance of all sacral groves in the region became visible in state discourse. Gavrilov, this baptized Tatar missionary, supplemented the description quoted above with a drawing of one sacral grove, perceiving his work almost as a salvage ethnography. Without such drawing, the next generation might not be able to even imagine, this place. No such demystification and rationalization of the sacral space was possible in ethnographic narratives of human sacrifice. Moreover, the timeline was never directed into the future. The deep forest remained a space where the past persisted. The deep forest of human sacrifice ethnographies was entirely non-transparent, painted in black and dark red colors of blood and death, and only dotted with magical fires and bones hanging on the trees. Wojciechs would assemble in their sacral forests as if in a state of hypnosis, following a, quote, fatal inevitability, and dressed in white clothes. In the dark forest, the white figures resembled the walking dead. Forest spirits and act of animal read human sacrifice animated Wojciechs to life, turning them from, quote, apathic, completely devoid of impressibility and curiosity, unquote, creatures into excited participants of an ancient ritual. The actual human sacrifice was almost never described. But in the carefully constructed, dark and mythical Gothic context of these ethnographies, the geese, horses, bulls, and other sacrificial animals appeared as codes for the main sacrificial offering, the human. And an ethnographer's personal familiarity with Wojciech animal sacrificed, and perhaps with some Wojciechs who, in fact, presumably participated and saw the human sacrifice, qualified him to discuss the bloody ritual. Professor Ivan Smirnov, the most theoretical of all the inventors of human sacrifice, the one who testified in court, was the author of a 260-page long monograph on Wojciechs published in 1890. So in this monograph, as well as his public lectures at Kazan University, he invited his readers to travel with him to use their imagination, of course, and travel with him to Borneo Island. There they would observe a ritual human sacrifice happening synchronously with the lecture. So in other words, to actually observe the human sacrifice, one had to travel to Borneo Island or closer to home to the deep forest. The trope embraced more eagerly by less sophisticated ethnographers than Smirnov. The unsettling Gothic atmosphere of the deep forest was essential in enabling this observation. This explains why the deep forest as the main locus of the Gothics was present even when an ethnographer of human sacrifice claimed that the actual murder of a human offering happened in the sacral shack, as was the case during the Multan trial, where the prosecution claimed that the beggar was murdered in a shack and then the body was dragged to the forest. So the usual explanation for this was that clan shacks were even less accessible to accidental visitors and curious ethnographers than sacral groves forests. The murder in a shack was thus a subplot of a major plot unfolding in the deep forest. Only having established this connection, the ethnographer of human sacrifice could proceed. Could proceed with ethnographic technicalities of the ritual itself. So the inclusion of many Wojciech terms and expressions in such narratives without much explanation resulted in an unsettling diglossia. Such ethnographies caught their readers between something quite familiar and utterly unfamiliar and strange, something very ancient but also very contemporary happening now, something very carnal and simultaneously mythical. In her study of Gothic literary tropes in Russian literature and journalism of the first half of the 19th century, Valeria Sobol has called this transgressive effect the imperial uncanny. According to Sobol, Gothic narratives tapped into imperial anxieties and exposed the, I quote, instability in the categories of one's own and the foreign, the familiar and the strange, self and other, a confusion resulting from the threatening ambiguity of the Russian imperial space, unquote. She argues that Gothic narratives expressed irrationality, transgression, past history haunting the present, and barbarism lurking behind under the veneer of civilization, unquote. So these narratives accompanied the incorporation of new peripheries, such as Finland, the Baltics, and Ukrainian lands in the 19th century into Russian imperial imagination. The late 19th century ethnographic narratives of Wojciech human sacrifice clearly exposed the same semantic complex of imperial uncanny. They, however, belong to a different epoch, when everything Gothic would be associated with archaism and when ethnography was claiming a status of objective science, consciously counterposing itself to literature. Moreover, unlike novels and literary ethnographies analyzed in Sobol book, the turn of the century ethnographies of human sacrifice located the imperial uncanny not in the peripheries, but in the very geographical center of the empire's old home. In this, they turned around Sobol's own definition of imperial uncanny that derives from Freudian uncanny, understood as the dissolution of boundaries between what is home and what is not, and Homi Bhabha's uncanny as expressing the essence of colonial and post-colonial disorientation caused by the collapse of boundaries between private and public, home and the outside world, self and other. Instead, Gothic ethnographies of Wojciech human sacrifice work to solidify the boundaries between what is home and what is not, between modernity and its other, between the real Russians and the mimic and false pretenders Russians. These Gothic stylized ethnographies achieve their stabilizing effect through evocation of science, selective utilization of Tyler anthropology, ethnographies of primitive societies, race theories, and other elements of modern scholarly repertoire. All of this allows us to interpret the turn-of-the-century ethnographic Gothics as a part of a modernist reworking of the genre that scholars have identified in Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and in the British colonial fiction. A savage within a modern society, living in an atemporal reality and incapable of development, was the main collective protagonist of such narratives that epitomized the late imperial uncanny. The ethnography of the imagined human sacrifice scientifically justified segregation of such a savage from imperial modernity. But the same ethnography, when embraced by the segregated savage, could turn into a symbolic subaltern anti-colonial rebellion. And the case of Grigory Vereshchagin, the same Vereshchagin who, as an expert in the Multan courtroom, denied the reality of the Wojciech blood label, is the most striking case in point. So recall that both the prosecution and the defense felt equally dissatisfied with Vereshchagin's expert persona and his ethnography. After the trial, the humiliated Vereshchagin reinvented himself as a Wojciech national writer in both Wojciech and Russian languages, and he embraced Wojciech human sacrifice as a self-exoticizing trope. He found in the ancient ritual of human sacrifice a symbolic representation of sacral Wojciech cosmology, of their real self, and a source of resistance to, well, colonial domination. In 1911, Vereshchagin published a story in like obscure news of the Arkhangelsk Society for the Study of Russian North. But this was a story stylized as an ethnographic account, literary ethnography. It was centered on a conversation between Vereshchagin's ethnographic informer, a young and literate former Wojciech soldier living in a village, with an old Wojciech beggar. And it opened with a reference to the Multan case. Quote, after the Multan case, the author, meaning Vereshchagin, the third voice, had decided to collect the most truthful evidence about the rituals of human sacrifice, unquote. The story unfolded in a secluded Wojciech world where all the protagonists were Wojciechs and information was judged according to Wojciech's own criteria of truth and morality. Vereshchagin's choice in favor of literary and not scientific ethnography allowed the construction of this purely Wojciech world and Wojciech regime of truth as a way of writing subaltern ethnography. This ethnography confirmed the persistence of human sacrifice among Wojciechs, but only where their life continued almost unimpacted by the presence of Russians. That is, in the most remote areas of the Volga-Kama region. There, a Wojciech clan called Bigra preserved all sacral traditions, and the last human sacrifice, according to the story, occurred like recently in the late 1870s. That Vereshchagin offered specific dates, chose a format of ethnographic interview to structure the plot, and supplemented the story with his commentaries delivered in the voice of a professional ethnographer influenced by the Multan case, exposed his conscious elaboration of an ethnographically believable narrative of human sacrifice, which was still intended as a counter-narrative, as a kind of a statement on behalf of subaltern science. Unlike Vereshchagin, the author and his young fictional informant, the old beggar never heard about the Multan case. He was disconnected from modern life. He possessed true knowledge and authentic, quotation marks, Wojciech worldview. So, sorry, I don't have this quote. Okay, the ritual act of ultimate barbarity, as narrated by the beggar, involved no violence, dirt, pain, rage, and other semantic elements of savagery. It was described as, the painless act. The victim was very well treated, was put to sleep, was first fed, and then there was nothing Gothic about the murder itself, and there was a question asked at the end by the Wojciech interviewer, and no internal organs were taken out from the victim. And the answer was, of course, not. And basically, part of the Wojciech ritual was mixing animal blood with human blood as a reference to totemic connections. And so, again, to Wojciech cosmology. Vereshchagin's narrative of human sacrifice included no Gothic elements. His reappropriation of the ethnography of human sacrifice was an attempt to reclaim the Wojciech's unique humanity and historicity, historical subjectivity from those who made them mute by denying them historicity and the ability to speak for themselves. Instead of being excluded from the imperial modernity as savages, Vereshchagin voluntarily withdrew on behalf of his people into an imagined, authentic past-present. But he's still wanted to communicate his version of Wojciech ethnography to the modern world. His ethnographic narrative of human sacrifice was conceived in an anti-colonial mode, but Vereshchagin's dependence on the binaries and the narrative of modern ethnography that transpired during the Multan case did not allow him to overcome the predicament of a mimic man. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Right, please.
Okay. Oh, all right. This sounds good. Last paper of the conference. I'll just start again by thanking Valeria for inviting me to what has just been a wonderful experience and set of discussions. So my paper is called Mother Tongue and Other Tongues, Aniensky and the Psychology of Language. And while I purport to talk about Aniensky, and I will, what I'm really doing here is sort of situating him at the end of a particular genealogy, which will become clear soon. So there's always been a certain myth about 19th century Russia concerning proficiency in foreign languages, particularly French, the daily and even primary use of which had long been associated with the aristocracy. As the pedagogue Vladimir Kunitsky put it in an 1886 essay, quote, "As everyone knows, foreign languages are studied nowhere else in the entire world in such a way as they are here in Russia," end quote. Everyone here includes foreigners, to whom Kunitsky attributes a stereotype concerning Russians' linguistic prowess in languages other than their own, that allegedly leads very often to the question, quote, "Is it true that in Russian schools you learn only French and German and that everyone speaks both of these languages?" End quote. So the implications of this myth are twofold. On the one hand, there is something quite flattering about the fact that it endows the Russian people with the seemingly inborn capacity for multilingualism, which they presumably must have achieved through years of dedicated and assiduous study. One thinks, too, of an analogous claim from a later period, in this case embraced and propagated as a common slogan, that the Soviet Union is the country in the world that reads the most, самая читающая страна в мире. On the other hand, the idea that Russians learn only French and German in their schools is not only obviously incorrect, but also raises questions about the integrity of Russian identity vis-à-vis the place of the Russian language, the mother tongue of the Russian people, in the formation of the nation state. So the second of these implications is what feeds into the real motivation behind Kunitsky's essay that I quoted, in which he is arguing against what he deems to be the outsized place of foreign languages in the Russian education system in the late 1880s. So my approach in this talk on the significance of родной язык, the mother tongue or the native language, as opposed to the many other tongues with which it so often coexists, follows that of the authors that I'm surveying in contrasting the teaching of Russian with the teaching of other languages, generally including French, German, and English, as well as Greek and Latin in the context of the gymnasium. In addition to continuing the long-standing practice of extensive education in foreign languages, the second half of the 19th century saw intensive efforts to promote the teaching of Russian in primary and secondary school contexts. And the pedagogical writings I examine from the 1860s to the 1890s all argue for a greater emphasis on the teaching of Russian based on practical as well as ideological considerations. The reasons for this were manifold. The rise of nationalism across Europe gave fresh urgency to act on the perceived link between language and national identity. The attendant crisis of identity among the Russian elite led to a renewed interest in the language and culture of people beyond the educated classes that was also reflected in the act of going to the people that unfolded in the literary sphere. And the gradual systematization of the educational system naturally opened a space for debates about how education in Russia ought to take place. So in chronological order of their writings, Konstantin Ushinsky, 1861, Vladimir Kunitsky, 1886, and Innokenty Aniensky, 1890, all operated under the assumption that there was an organic and indissoluble link between a language and its people. Aniensky, I argue, is unique in this sequence for his foregrounding of the psychology of the individual in his discourse on how language is learned and what the place of literature is in that process. Like his predecessors, however, the insights he brings about the development of the individual are nonetheless extrapolated to apply to the whole of Russian society and the cultivation of a sense of that wholeness. Accordingly, as Yasemin Yildiz observes in her study on the post-monolingual condition, the promotion of a mother tongue, which in our case is родной язык, is, quote, a key structuring principle that organizes the entire range of modern social life, from the construction of individuals and their proper subjectivities to the formation of disciplines and institutions, as well as of imagined collectives such as cultures and nations. According to this paradigm, individuals and social formations are imagined to possess one true language only, their mother tongue, and through this possession to be organically linked to an exclusive, clearly demarcated ethnicity, culture, and nation, end quote. The fact that Ushinsky, Kunitsky, and Aniensky each saw fit to argue against an overemphasis on the teaching of foreign languages implies that while it was not their goal to bring about in Russia what might be called a strictly monolingual condition, they perceived problems or even a crisis in the existing hierarchy of languages as reflected in the ways they were taught, and sought to elevate родной язык in relation to the French, etc., that threatened not only national unity and a sense of patriotic belonging and civic duty, but also the psychological and spiritual development of the individual member of the Russian polity. Each therefore gives родной язык pride of place in his argument, and examining that genealogy of Russian pedagogical thought that here culminates in Aniensky's psychology of language can offer an understanding of the ways in which the concept of родной язык acquired and maintained a symbolic value in discussions of education and upbringing in late imperial Russia. So Konstantin Ushinsky is remembered foremost as the founder of scientific pedagogy in Russia. The 1861 essay called Родное слово I have chosen as a starting point predates his better-known textbook of the same name by 3 years. This essay, first published in the Journal of the Ministry of National Education, Журнал Министерства народного просвещения, stands as an initial statement of Ushinsky's philosophy regarding the importance of the native language that he would bring to bear on the materials he created for use in Russian classrooms. The importance of родной язык, or родное слово, for Ushinsky lies in its capacity to serve as the vehicle for the accumulated consciousness and experiences of a given people throughout its history. Accordingly, his starting premise is that, quote, a language is the most living, abundant, and solid link uniting past, current, and future generations of a people in a single great historic living whole, end quote. And then, more quote, when the language of a people disappears, there is no longer a people, end quote. We can discern in this statement an affirmation of the organic link between a people and their language that thinkers of this era accepted more or less as an a priori proposition. Ushinsky, in fact, makes explicit his view that the origin of a language lies precisely in its people and in no other. The Russian language, it follows, is the patrimony of the Russian people, fashioned not only by the natural circumstances of the nature, climate, and geography of Russia, but also by, quote, a single secret seed tucked away somewhere in the depths of the people's spirit, end quote. Indeed, Ushinsky attributes to a people's common language the very creation of this spirit, indicating in a romantic manner the resonance between the Russian language and other natural phenomena particular to Russia, the sky, fields, mountains, hills, forests, rivers, and other elements that point to a primordial connection between the people's language and their surroundings. A language is what one generation bequeaths unto the next, and it serves as the treasure trove of, quote, the fruits of deep movements of the heart, the fruits of historical events, faith, worldview, the traces of grief and happiness experienced. In short, a people carefully preserves the entire trace of its spiritual life in the people's word, end quote. The reverence with which Ushinsky approaches the concept of родной язык is entirely commensurate with the fundamental role in defining the very character of the people that he attributes to it. It stands to reason, therefore, that the teaching of Russian would stand at the top of his list of educational priorities. Moreover, родной язык for Ushinsky is any individual's first and greatest teacher, by which he means that the process of first language acquisition on the part of a child necessarily serves as a medium for and takes place in tandem with the acquisition of basic concepts and the formation of an individual's subjectivity in relation to the world they inhabit, an idea to which I will return in greater detail in my discussion of Aninsky's later text. Despite the title of his essay, Родное слово, and the significance that he grants родной язык, Ushinsky in fact spends the greater part of his article discussing not Russian but foreign languages, particularly French, which garners his special ire as a language whose education is not only the most widespread among Russian educational institutions, but also seems to serve the least useful of the four purposes of studying foreign languages that he articulates, that of communicating with other Russians in a language that is not Russian. What indeed, asks Ushinsky, could be the purpose of expending so much by way of time and resources in unlocking the ability to speak in a language other than the родной язык among people who in fact do have this in common, especially since the present state of the teaching of foreign languages in Russia seems predominantly to deliver poor results? This phenomenon, he claims, arises from, quote, the stupid demands of fashion, as well as the fact that the French language helps in part to mask a person's stupidity, enabling them to flaunt someone else's mind with incisive and deft phrases, end quote. It is strongly implied, moreover, that this condition of stupidity is itself the result of insufficient immersion in родной язык, which serves Ushinsky further in his promotion of the systematic teaching of Russian in primary and secondary schools across Russia. In place of the self-important posturing of high society, Ushinsky argues, it is not only more logical and efficient, but also more patriotic and natural to use родной язык among the population for whom it is, in fact, родной. This is not to suggest, however, that Ushinsky calls for the advent of monolingualism among the Russian population. Though his hostility to French in particular is palpable, he not only identifies three better reasons to study foreign languages in the name of determining the best possible approach to their learning and teaching, which are to gain access to their literature, to exercise the mind, and to communicate with non-Russians. But he even goes so far as to declare that, quote, only the knowledge of foreign European languages, especially modern ones, can give the Russian the possibility of full, independent, and not one-sided development. And without this, the direct, broad path of science will be forever closed to him, end quote. As such, even in his full-throated encomium of родной язык, Ushinsky in 1861 acknowledges the need for education in French, German, and English, not merely to continue, but to be modulated according to the needs and abilities of individual learners and their goals, so long as such learners have properly prepared themselves for the task by acquiring an effective education in their native language. 25 years later, in 1886, Kunitsky takes a harder stance against the compulsory study of foreign languages, identifying it as, quote, the single area of teaching that is evidently insured against any attacks from all kinds of even the smallest attempts at eliminating or decreasing it. Only one subject is considered by everyone to be essential and necessary, and in the opinion of some, ought even to be increased, end quote. So a very different situation from ours today. His evidence for this claim consists of compiling the number of hours assigned to each subject in schools, and indeed across different types of educational institutions. The number of hours consecrated to foreign languages outnumbers those devoted to Russian language by as much as a factor of 5. In the case of the classical gymnasium, but even in the most equitable case of the cadet corps by almost double. A figure that he repeats in this essay is that a full 2/3 of students' time is spent on the study of foreign languages, but this assertion does not actually match up to the numbers he provides. The arguments against this state of affairs are in some ways not dissimilar to those of Ushinsky in terms of blaming the fashions of the past. So Kunitsky refers to a past period, quote, when one French word was valued more highly among us than a poem written in Russian with talent, end quote. But by Kunitsky's time, the effects of an educational system put in place with the mores of a bygone era in mind, have resulted, he claims, in damage being done to students' knowledge of родной язык and their relationship to it. He points not only to the prodigious amount of time demanded by the study of foreign languages in schools, but also to the long history of what he calls Russian subservience to the languages of Western Europe, as well as to the proliferation of study aids for foreign languages that treat the Russian language haphazardly, such as in a translation of the French phrase j'ai une bonne mère as я имею одну добрую мать. Amid all this, Kunitsky's main claim is an ideological one about the place of Russia and its language on the world stage, and about the place of the Russian language in the educational makeup of the Russian person. In this, he appears to run somewhat counter to Ushinsky's admission that it is necessary for educated Russians to know foreign languages in addition to their own. Is it not time for us to declare ourselves, he asks, once and for all, mature before the face of Europe? Is it not time to make the Russian school a school of Russian language, allowing those who wish it to study foreign languages as well, if that is what they want? Is it not time to realize and loudly assert this through a thoroughgoing reform in our school programs, that knowing foreign languages is not a distinguishing feature of education and gives nothing of moral educational value to the Russian? So, though Kunitsky also stops short of insisting on a monolingual population, it's clear that he's calling for the activation of the potential inherent in schooling, as Yildiz describes, to serve as one of the primary means of such a social engineering of the monolingual paradigm for the modern nation state. If Kunitsky's primary aim is to argue for elevating the place of Russian in comparison to other languages, Aniansky's looks inward to the role played by родной язык in the inner life of the individual. So in an 1890 essay called On the Educational Significance of the Native Language, the teacher, translator, and poet also argues for the importance of teaching Russian first. For knowledge of one's first language, forms not only the foundation of one's inner life, but also the base for any further learning, including the learning of subsequent languages. So in this, there is an echo of Ushinsky's observation that a child learns about life at the same time as they learn their first language, but also a precursor to what we are now accustomed to thinking of as the fields of first and second language acquisition. Aniansky builds on this idea to highlight родной язык for the primary role it plays in the cultivation of the mind and spirit, for it is through one's родной язык that one first develops feelings, desires, and the means to express them. Like Ushinsky, he points out that a child learns to speak and think at the same time, and therefore these processes are tightly linked in what will eventually become the child's spiritual organization. Unlike him, he more precisely cites Broca's area as the localized seat of linguistic activity in the brain, and approaches the initial development of language as a series of processes whereby a child develops the organic motor skills of phonetic articulation in tandem with the mental associations between words and the concepts they signify. Eventually, родной язык emerges as, quote, the language of prayer, poetry, moral, and civic duty, end quote, thereby encompassing not just the inner life of an individual, but also the apparatus whereby the individual relates to their surroundings and comes to understand their role as part of a whole. A language is a marker of nationality, he writes, that is, a combination of generic features from the manifestations in speech of people's spiritual life, belonging to a single people and living a collective life in spiritual communication, end quote. Proper education in the first language is thus necessary not only for individual well-being, but extrapolating from there to the well-being of the people as a whole. Yet, like Kunitsky, Aniansky identifies in the Russian people a barely conscious relationship to our native language, necessitating, therefore, this essay in which he argues for reaffirming the centrality of родной язык not merely on spiritual grounds, but on psychological ones as well. So the faculty that ultimately needs to be developed in Aniansky's estimation is a feeling for language, языковое чутье, a term with which he is not fully satisfied, but offers as a Russian alternative to a German word, Sprachgefühl, that he ironically has in mind. So this term can be unfolded to mean not just the sense of being able to deploy the right word or expression in every situation that Aniansky explicitly has in mind, but also the positive affect vis-a-vis language, for whose importance, like Kunitsky, he also argues. However, this feeling for language is a zero-sum game. It can degrade for a number of reasons that have to do, again, with foreign languages. It weakens when another language is being studied at the same time. Thinking in one lowers one's ability to think in another. Time spent in one language necessarily means time not spent in another. In this, Aniensky is giving fuller development to and putting his own spin on ideas earlier espoused by Ushinsky. For Aniensky's part, proper mastery of the first language paves the way toward easy acquisition of a second or third. For in this case, all of the elementary psychological acts that lie at the base of acquiring speech have already taken place. And the same skills of analysis and imitation can be applied to further languages, if not as effectively as the first. But it is for this reason that the first language still retains pride of place as the one that is, quote, more closely linked than any other to a person's spiritual world, end quote. And as far as he is concerned, that's the way things ought to be. Moreover, языковое чутье on the part of an individual can too be extrapolated and compared to an average standard языковое чутье that defines the people to which they belong, creating the organic and indissoluble link between an individual speaker of родной язык with all others. The primary medium for the development of this link, Aniensky argues, is the study of the literature that serves as a repository for a people's character on which both individual and collective языковое чутье may be continually honed. In this way, Aniensky's analysis of the role and importance of родной язык derives not fully from an a priori equation of a language with a people, as in Ushinsky's understanding, nor does it rest on an ideological stance like Kunitsky's regarding the place of Russian in relation to other languages. Instead, focusing on a bottom-up model of родной язык that originates primarily in the lived experience of each individual speaker, and so lends itself to the creation of a linguistic community that maps onto that of the nation. Aniensky provides perhaps the most cogent defense among these thinkers of the significance of родной язык, as well as the fullest expression of the many facets of its symbolic value, bolstered by his engagement with contemporary psychology and its implications for pedagogy that came to bear on debates about language education in late imperial Russia. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. And now the floor goes to the discussant, Ilya Vinsky.
Maybe I'll need.
Micro.
Yeah. Don't tell. Is it okay? Yeah. Anyone, but I've always preferred historians to literary critics because historians base their arguments on hard data and on close reading, as opposed to some of my, including myself, fellow literary critics who prefer theories to the analysis. And Marina's.
We'll tell everyone.
No, please don't. It's my rhetorical device. Yes, but seriously speaking, Professor Magilner's presentation paper is extremely important. It's not just a case study, but it reveals, and it's very important for literary criticism as well, because it shows what actually happened in the movement which we call like realism on its road to something which we call modernism, with its fascination with issues related to some dark secrets, mysticism, and rituals. But again, the period of the which is considered in Marina's paper, is perhaps the crucial one. It's also related, I believe, to Vadim's paper, because this is the period of this moment when naturalism switches or moves into the direction of symbolism, but it's still very distinct moment when there is a balance between reliance on sciences, but also some feeling that there are some certain things which are irrational and which strike back. So Marina focuses on the case of moral panic among late 19th century Russian educated society provoked by the so-called Molten case. What I'm going to do now, I'll briefly sketch out four interpretative circles of context, which may or may not pose certain questions for their elaboration. The first one deals with the concept of Gothics as related to ethnography, and which I think is the major achievement of this particular research. From what I understand as a literary critic, Gothic and ethnography has gone hand in hand from the very beginning. Of course, we should take into account the early stage of ethnography, but if you look at the late 18th, early 19th century literature, ethnographies, collections of various field research work, starting from, I don't know, Percy's collections of antiquities to Sir Walter Scott collection of ballads. The literature and ethnographic, of course, again, at this particular stage of the development of the early development of the discipline, or the Grimm brothers collection of fairy tales, they all were connected to certain societal, historical processes, but also presented the glimpses into not the past, but the present, and some kind of obsessions, fears, anxieties of contemporaries of this so-called romantic age. I'll bring just one example, which I think is closely related to Professor Magilna's talk, and it's also related to kind of debate which Lera Sobel and I had while discussing her chapter on Imperial Gothic. It centered on Karamzin's proverbial story, The Island of Bornholm, which Valeria considers from her point of view. And I suggested an alternative reading of the story based on a strange moment, the vision, the nightmare of the traveler who enters this Danish island, but reveals the secrets of Baltic Slavs. And there is the scene, like real obscure scene, a nightmare, when the protagonist, the narrator, tells about certain like monsters, Slavic monsters actually, who enters the room, tries to pierce him with numerous swords. They have many hands, and I suggest that this is a clear reference to human sacrifice of the Baltics, which Karamzin himself referred to in the history of the Russian state when he discusses the Slavdom, the early Slavdom, and when he considers human sacrifice as inherent, as a part of the history of Vladimir's Rus, as well as Baltic Slavic tribes. And for him it was very important. So back to the Gothic story, the Gothicism of the story derives from this penetration, the vision, literary vision rather than ethnographic or historical one, into the dark secret of Slavdom. So from this perspective, what if the story of Multans is related to the secret of Slavdom as well? Because they all knew that from Karamzin and from this particular story, that human sacrifice was a part of the dark part, as if erased by Christianity, but now it comes, it strikes back. The second context, which I want to mention really briefly, is the Western colonial narratives of cannibalism, which also constitute a very characteristic feature of the late 19th century cultural anxieties. Not only Jekyll and Hyde case, not only this fear of cannibalism as presented in imperial colonial tales of Borneo, or I don't know, Captain Cook's case, or something of this type. But I just did a brief research, and surprisingly, at the very same time, in the late 1880s, there were several trials of cannibals in London. So there's a fear of cannibalism, which is a part of our own self within the British context. I'm not sure, but I suspect that something similar existed, was presented in French history. Let me just refer to a popular ballad tale about a certain barber in Fleet Street who cut the throats of his customers and then sunk them down a trap to a kitchen where they made inter, and whence they issued as mutton pies. Sweeney Todd's case, which was presented in many ballads and references of the late late 19th century. Another dark secret and the fear of cannibalism. What does the human this fear and anxiety tells us about the culture of cultures of 19th century, of the Western culture of 19th century. The third contextual circle is local ethnic stereotypes. This is true that the libel, as Marina showed, was invented by scratch, but also it departed from a certain stereotype which was associated with the Votyaks in Russian, I don't know, like historical ethnographic literature of the second half of the 19th century. Say in the Atlas Народы России, Peoples of Russia, ethnographiczkie очерки dated 1862, Votyaks are presented as half-wild, полудикий, суеверный народ, пленники множества предрассудков, суеверий и мрачных условностей. Те из них, кто не крещен, приносят жертвы злому духу. Of course, it's not about human sacrifices, but it's about perhaps the most unenlightened tribe within the Russian Empire. Saltykov-Shchedrin also refers to Votyaks and two groups, those who were recently baptized and they still worship their gods, and those who had been baptized and Christianized earlier. This fear and fascination, which it also originates something which is characteristic for the late 19th century, the fear and fascination with pagan rites. I'll just very, very briefly refer to Nikolai Leskov's thick description of the rite of Korovya Smert at daggers drawn, the anti-nihilist novel. So for some reason, the fear of nihilists goes hand in hand with the fear of some pagan rituals related to death. In Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, there is a similar episode. Tolstoy's interest, here we have not the fear, but fascination with the rite of Voguls, which he presents, discusses at length in What is Art trend. And later on, Vladimir Solovyov's, then George Florovsky's and Bernatsky's theory of day and night cultures. So like as if Russian Christianity, and now I go back to the initial context, is like not complete Christianization. So some dark secrets which are prophesied and are present in the secret rites, in the darkness of the forest. I really love your concept of chronotop, of the thicket. Becomes in the later period almost like a manifesto of what Russian culture is. It has the day culture and the night culture. Last but not least, the context of late realism. That's the paradox of realism. It started with the intention to get rid of all illusions, of all myths of the Romantic age. That's what I call realist exorcism. But it ended up with spectralizing what we call reality or actuality and presenting Russia as a haunted house, which is obsessed with various specters, from a nihilist to peasant to a secret sect or society. And in this case, Professor Magelner adds a very interesting glimpse into another late realist specter, which helps us to understand, serves as a bridge to the symbolist literature, including, I don't know, Sologub, Brusov, other writers, and a little bit later, Gorodetsky was his interest in paganism. So it just feels a very important gap into the history of Russian obsessions of the late realist, early modernist age. Now let me turn to Brian's very, very interesting presentation on mother tongue and other tongues. The discussion of these three articles is fascinating. The question which I have is, why did you choose these particular authors, and specifically Kunitsky? Because to tell you the truth, Kunitsky is not someone who is famous. Who was Kunitsky? And how did Kunitsky, as well as Ushinsky and Aninsky represents particular cultural ideological trends and periods of their own time. Because Kunitsky, 1885, right? It's like Alexander II policy of Russification. Ushinsky represent the age of great reforms and the beginning actually of the age of great Russian novel, which of course is written in Russian. But 1862 is also the year when Tolstoy comes with his pedagogical theories. This is also the year very close to when Vladimir Daz publishes his dictionary of life. Great Russian language, which also starts with this harsh critique of other foreign language. This is the period of Slavophile critique of Western languages, which has been beautifully examined by Professor Boris Gasparov. So contextualization of this thing. And I really liked the accent on Aninsky, because Aninsky should be pushed into this discussion, and you did it beautifully, because he introduces a very new approach to this родное слово, as you showed. And he starts the tradition which would echo later on. In very unexpected context. So I would conclude my discussant's remarks with one quotation from this article by Aninsky and its echo. Is it possible, is there a link between the article «Образовательное значение родного языка» with its central thesis? I'm sorry, I didn't translate it into English. В нормальных условиях родной язык есть язык отечественный. С этим языком человек связан не только физически, но и нравственно. Это язык молитвы, поэзии, нравственного и гражданского долга. This is the language of prayer, of poetry, of the moral and civic responsibility, duty. Мои обязанности по отношению к этому языку есть часть моих обязанностей по отношению к отечеству. So this is my responsibility in regards, duty in regards with the fatherland. Я должен поддерживать, the accent is on must, I have to, I should, поддерживать и разрабатывать родной язык, и изучая, помнить, что он составляет одно из драгоценнейших достояний народных, что с ним исконными узами связано миросозерцание народа, его развитие и творчество. Я говорю должен, но обязанности наши по отношению к нашей родной речи суть не что-нибудь формальное, потому что мы не можем не любить ее. And I had this strange impression, maybe I'm wrong, that this manifesto-like statement not only introduces a certain approach to the language, to родная речь, which is full of innate associations between words with this языковое чувство, with this very concrete material and psychologically justified approach to language, with Aninsky students' approach. Particularly with Anna Akhmatova and her famous poem published in 1942 «Мужество», «Но мы сохраним тебя, русская речь, великое русское слово», the Russian родное слово, which is called like «чистое и свободное». What if she refers not to the official state propaganda linguistic patriotism, but to this psychologized approach to родное слово, which had been introduced by Aninsky 1 year after Anna Akhmatova was born. So there might be intermediate stage, and he might have talked about this. So that's all I wanted to say. And thank you again for the presentations.
Thank you. Since we are a little beyond the limits of our panel, I suggest that we take a few more questions and then panelists will respond to them all in a package. Do you mind? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yes.
Thank you for these really, really wonderful papers. I so enjoyed listening to them. Marina, and I wanted to, I was fascinated by this, and I know very little about the entry of ethnography into the legal sphere in Russia at this time, so it was just totally interesting. Thinking about the entry of the insanity defense into, or the insanity defense's place within the legal sphere, I've been very interested in my own work by the ways in which the insanity defense actually makes the category of the human open to political violence, by suggesting that it's suddenly possible to define what sanity is, and so then to expose the body to capital punishment, right? If you can be deemed sane, then you can be punished as sane. And so I wondered if one of the things that was at stake among the many brilliant points that Ilya brought up with connections to human sacrifice was something like human sacrifice as a reflection on the coming into being of the human as a category that can now be legally exposed to violence within the juridical sphere. So the focus on human sacrifices is much a commentary on, a primitivizing otherness of, right, that suggests that there are some people out there who do this horrible thing, as it is a symptom of the coming into being of human sacrifice within the civilized world. And that there is now a human sacrifice that is not part of an other group, but is all too close to home, as it were. And perhaps that has a dimension of the Freudian unheimlich, right? In addition to the self-other. So I'd be very curious about that. And Brian, I was wondering about any potential connections to Vygotsky's work and Vnútorný reč. And that may be purely speculative on my part. So thank you.
A very small comment on Brian's, is which is the obvious one. Is where's Turgenev in the three authors? Right? What is that kind of thinking about linking nationalism and language? Where's that in them?
Thank you so much. I learned so much from both your papers, and my comments are for Brian. I had two directions that I'm just curious. I'm not saying they're absent. I'm just wondering if in your discussion of how the argument was made for the pedagogy of the Russian language to be forwarded on behalf of, solidifying a kind of social, cultural, national identity. I wondered if you found that there were any kinds of other pedagogical practices that were brought into that project at the same time. I'm thinking specifically of the mass gymnastics craze in the nationalizing 19th century, and the Sokols and the Spartakiads, and how those were parts of like, let's do these very specific material pedagogical things in order to create a sense of community. And then the other direction, my curiosity wandered was in thinking about all of these attempts to linguistically unify people in the nationalizing era. There were also at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, a lot of creations of imaginary languages. And so Zaum and Esperanto and untold, hundreds and hundreds of others. And I would love to hear you talk about that, even just speculatively, about if those two movements are related. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful papers. I have a question that I've been thinking about. So I read Marina's paper before, and I kept thinking about the relationship between cannibalism and human sacrifice and whether we should separate them, because you used at one, like in your the draft that I read, you used the word dehumanizing, and I was thinking about that word because I was thinking, okay, wait a second, why is it dehumanizing? Animals don't commit animal sacrifices as part of ritual, although they do eat other animals, right? And so I was thinking, what is interesting about human sacrifice is that it is neither natural nor, right? It's neither civilized nor natural. It belongs in this kind of space of in-betweenness, which like cannibalism wouldn't, because, right, cannibalism, you could say that belongs to the realm of nature and doesn't belong to the realm of culture. Meanwhile, with human sacrifice, something really strange is happening there because it's neither nor. So that's, yeah. So it's
All right, so let's give the floor to panelists and give them a chance to respond. Marina.
Well, thank you so much. I want to return the compliment. I really feel very fortunate to have a chance to receive feedback from literary scholars, because from my colleague historian, this is usually additional information. From literary scholar, these are new paradigms for thinking about problems that interest me. So thank you so much. I will start with questions and then I continue with your comments. On cannibalism and human sacrifice, very briefly, of course, I always, follow your suggestions. So I didn't use dehumanizing in this paper, but actually, especially in the Moulton case, cannibalism was a very important part of the accusation of human sacrifice, and probably in a kind of larger version I have to explicate on the connections. But for Korolenko, he always insisted in his commentaries on cannibalism. So how the Russian Empire can have cannibals in the late 19th century, in their midst. So there is this connection that places human sacrifice in the domain of nature rather than culture. And so this helps to solidify this border between savagery and modernity. And what is at stake is indeed whether we can integrate this people, basically populating the very core of the empire, into the emerging imperial modernity, the post-reform modernity with all this mixture and movements and liquids and then hard objects like moving around and mixing. So whether this is possible or not. So, but I have to think about the incorporation of cannibalism into the discourse, because there are other examples where you don't see necessarily cannibalism as part of it, and this is probably kind of would be the examples of the Silver Age kind of aesthetic constructions of self-exoticizing by embracing human sacrifice. Okay, so with Kate's question, which is also, I have to think about this, but my kind of immediate response is insanity defense centers individual. So this is an individual diagnosis. Human sacrifice is, as a diagnosis, targets a group. It's this epoch of nations and nationalism. So if it's never an individual, and during the Moulton case, again, which is an archetypal case, the argument goes that even if this 10 Wojciechs on trial are not implicit in this crime, Wojciechs in general, as we know, commit, human sacrifice. So, and here, it's of course, it opens, this collective body for political violence, but it also kind of allows to racialize, and that's why it's kind of occurs on different kind of planes. But I have to think more about this. Thank you. And with the context offered by Ilya, this is, first of all, super useful. And second of all, this is basically how I think about the project in general. The connection between Gothics and ethnography, of course. I mean, ethnography uncovers, dark past and studies cultures outside of civilization, outside of Christianity. Of course, Gothic elements are always present, but I am focusing on the period when ethnography becomes a legitimate institutionalized field, and the field that operates with a kind of a new analytical repertoire that allows to overcome this dependence on Gothic, such as evolutionary timelines, such as the concept of survival, which kind of makes this terrible things much less dangerous, really. This is just empty shells of something that had lost its meaning already, typologies and on the rest. And so my argument is that you have a very conscious construction Actually, these people, they make a choice. They know what they are doing. They construct this narrative. This is not just a kind of a natural part of this ethnographic gaze. With Karamzin, this is also very interesting, and this is part of the stories that I'm telling, because part of the story is about modern ethnography, not missionary, but modern ethnography of pagan sacrifice. And well, actually, Karamzin writes not about human sacrifice. He writes about genocide, the killing of older people who are not useful to the community, which is a way to modernize, Russian historical narrative, which is a way to say that we are just like, those ancient Greeks. Lay ethnographer, they borrowed this from Karamzin, and the first examples of descriptions, mid-19th century, of what a human sacrifice, they killed their elders. And there are all this, again, like myth about how they do this. So, but then, this evolves into, something else. Western colonialism is very important context, of course. And what you mentioned, this trials in London, the rise of the discourse of cannibalism. There is a wonderful book by Koklik it's called Savage Within, and I actively borrow, the title because it's really right on the point. But basically, this is a kind of an invented tradition which coincides with the changes in like global imperialism. So on the one hand, you have, the invention of the concept of traditional society within the, British sciences, and also in Germany. On the other hand, you have the rise of nationalizing empires. You have the rise of this new imperial kind of thinking about that tends to think about metropole in nationalizing terms. And so the kind of the new urgency of demarcating these boundaries between those who belong and those who don't leads to the rise of, again, this cannibalism, accusations of all kinds of racialized, of all kinds of hunting for savages within metropole societies, and transfer of technologies of knowledge from colonies into metropole. This really helps to understand what is happening in the Russian Empire. When we have the same kind of parallelism, this really explains that we are dealing with a very modern context, that the Russian Empire looks at the Western context and thinks about, okay, what is wrong with us? So how can we become a modern empire? How should we deal with this? Local ethnic stereotypes, absolutely relevant. Another very important context, what you mentioned, this Atlas 16.2, this is basically the later examples of the early epoch when you have Georgi and others, like foreign Western travelers first entering Russian Empire, creating these atlases. And so this is a kind of Larry Wolff inventing Eastern Europe kind of imagination, and there is no much difference here between Wojciechs and their savagery, and basically, all kinds of Russian peasants and their savagery. But local context on Wojciechs is very important because, and I'm writing the history of the rumor, because there was this rumor in the region about, and this is a very diverse region with Muslim people and multiple Finno-Ugric peoples and Russians, and this was an unattached signifier, the rumor that someone commits suicide. But this was not attached to Wojciechs. You find many examples of how this rumor really appears whenever locals deal with the state. Whenever the state is in, someone applies this rumor to someone, so it pinned the rumor to Chuvash, pinned the rumor to Wojciechs, and they compete for the land, and they bribe state officials, and the rumor appears. And then I trace how the rumor becomes integrated into, this ethnographic narrative, because this is folklore, this is local knowledge. Okay, and so I'm just to conclude, basically, yes, this is the story that should be written in well, multiple contexts, and I'm very grateful for all the hints. I created a list of what I should think about. Thank you.
I'll try to be as brief as I can. Thank you so much for your comments, Ilya, and your questions. I think, so why these particular authors was the first thing that came up. And the truth, actually, is that Kunitsky was the first of the people that I started working on. And he has been retained as a result of his having some very forceful opinions about the place of foreign languages in the Russian school. And his article is called On the Problem of Teaching Foreign Languages in the Russian School. And that was the problem that I was most interested in initially. So that's why he's there. Otherwise, he's kind of a nobody as far as I understand. He's certainly, you know, it's weird, I admit, to put him on the same line as someone like Kunitsky.
Contextualize it.
Yeah. But I mean, to that point, though, there's so many different ways this sort of genealogy or timeline can be filled. So I think you probably guessed that I wanted to start after the Great Reforms because so much had happened to the educational system. First of all, there is an educational system, and it's supposed to apply to everybody. That's new, right? So that seemed like a good starting point, but at the same time, you could very easily go back. There's the conservative commentators in the first half of the 19th century. Oh, the other thing that I wanted to make sure had already happened by the time I started talking about this problem is the idea that there is such a thing as a Russian nation state occupied by a Russian people, and that link is in place. So that means going too far back, for example, because going too far back would not have worked for this particular purpose, I think, even though we could go as far back as Novikov. If we really wanted. And if you read what he writes about language, he doesn't see that organic and indissoluble link between a language and its people at all. That's not an operative concept for him. But I'm digressing. We can go back in time, we can go forward in time. Vygotsky would be a really cool person to look at in terms of the dialogue between what's going on between him and the sort of constellation of people who end for the moment for me with Anyansky. And in some ways, Anyansky, I think, was just lucky because he's saying a lot of similar things to the people who came before him. It's just that by the time he's doing it, we know more about the brain and how it works. So he's actually able to bring in some of those insights and use those to create a sort of practicum. The second half of this article is all about how to actually do the day-to-day work of teaching in the classroom. And if Akhmatova happened to be referring to this psychologized view of language that she might have gotten from Anyansky, then that means that version of education did exactly the kind of work that it was supposed to, doesn't it? So let me see here. And oh, so the other pedagogical practice, and Ilya, you also mentioned Tolstoy, and that's also, I think this will address both Ilya's bringing up Tolstoy and Kimberly's question to a certain extent on other pedagogical practices that were happening around this time. I think less so than specific practices per se, what I see happening certainly starting in the 60s and more as we move on, is more of a focus on the education of the individual in particular, and that relationship between the healthy individual and the healthy collective. But that can't happen if you're an individual student who, by the way, now is sitting in school because it's compulsory, so they have to be there. If that individual is bored or unhappy or just disinterested or has stuff going on in the home or distracted, or like these considerations suddenly become a real problem that people who educate and think about education are actually talking about and discussing. So I think there is this sort of, on the one hand, a democratization of education that's taking place during this time, but on the other, also a sort of foregrounding and uplifting of the individual psyche that then comes to bear on policies and strategies for education. The imaginary languages, I actually can speak more than speculatively about this, but I will only do so very briefly in the interest of time. But Esperanto is the big one, of course. It was preceded by things like Volapük that made their way to Russia, but were just deemed too complicated, right? So the people who are creating these languages, these international auxiliary languages, have this sort of pie-in-the-sky utopian vision in mind, of course. And they, I think, constitute a totally different camp from the родноязык guys who are like, it has to be Russian, and because that's part of you, it's embedded into your soul somehow. And for these people, who are also the ones who occupy the ranks of people who are actually making educational policy, it has to be Russian. And the major disadvantage, the fatal flaw of something like Esperanto is precisely that it is universally accessible and belongs to everyone. So there are two, I think, well, they're related conceptually, these projects of the national language on the one hand and the universal one on the other, but I think they're really operating at cross purposes, even if some of the people would like, they're working towards similar ideals in as much as they want everyone to get an education and be able to have rich inner lives and contribute to their societies this way, but the path whereby they get there is diametrically opposed. Thank you.